At the very beginning, Nick and I walked onto the set claiming we had an identical mindset regarding the creative rhythm of the partnership, acting like we were totally in sync about how these characters should vibe. We really tried to sell that narrative, putting in the work together and meticulously rehearsing scenes over and over again to build a connection that, spoiler alert, never actually materialised. Usually when Tinseltown heavyweights go to war, the story ends with polished publicist denials, aggressive damage control and non-disclosure agreements. But this specific disaster broke all the rules. When the cameras finally stopped rolling on the train wreck that was I Love Trouble, Juliaroberts didn't just pack her bags and flee from Nick Nolte, she let the ugly, unvarnished truth trail right behind her like a shadow. For decades, the studio spin doctors tried to frame their legendary feud as nothing more than a simple personality clash. Just two massive A-listers who mixed like oil and water. That excuse was incredibly convenient for the executives trying to protect their investment, but let's be real, it was completely hollow and barely scratched the surface of the toxicity. We are talking about a grown man who suddenly decided to throw tantrums because crew members were whispering while he was trying to work. It was classic diva behaviour, and this isn't just idle speculation or tabloid trash. This wasn't a case of mutual dislike. This is the story of how the biggest actress on the planet quietly dismantled the silence to expose what actually went down with Nick Nolte, leaving a stain on the industry that still hasn't washed out. We are discussing a film that by all metrics should have been thrown into the bargain bin and forgotten immediately. See, Hollywood is addicted to conflict, but only when it is strictly scripted, heavily controlled and safely contained within the four corners of a movie screen. The industry absolutely loathes real unscripted conflict, the kind of backstage chaos where fragile egos shatter and silence is the only currency that matters. For 30 years, one of the nastiest wars in modern cinema history was flattened into late-night talk show jokes, dismissed as creative differences, or reduced to the lazy narrative of two stars with big heads butting into each other. But that sanitised version of events was always too neat, too perfectly packaged, and frankly completely dishonest about the reality of the situation. What actually transpired on the set of I Love Trouble wasn't just a difference of opinion or a petty rivalry between co-stars. It was a slow-motion psychological car crash that everyone saw coming, but no one could stop. The situation spiraled so out of control that the entire production shifted from filmmaking into full-blown crisis management mode just to get the footage in the can. Juliaroberts, a superstar whose billion-dollar brand was built on being the relatable girl next door, with the infectious laugh walked away from that project carrying a dark secret the studios never wanted to validate. She didn't scream and shout to the press immediately, she didn't stage a public meltdown, and she refused to feed the gossip rags the juicy sound bites they were desperate for. Instead, she did something that terrified the suits. Far more than a tantrum, she played the long game and waited. And when she finally decided to spill the tea years later, she didn't do it with tears or theatrics, but with a cold precision that caused the official story to crumble instantly. This isn't just juicy gossip for the sake of clicks, and it isn't about pointing fingers at who was more difficult to work with. It is a masterclass on how power really operates in La La Land, how silence is weaponized, and why the world's most famous woman waited until she was untouchable to let the truth surface. Once you actually comprehend the nightmare that happened on that set, you start seeing a disturbing pattern that goes way beyond one flop movie. That is the moment this story stops being just an uncomfortable anecdote and starts looking like something genuinely dangerous. Theoretically, I Love Trouble looked like a harmless cash grab on paper. It was supposed to be a standard mid-budget romantic thriller, entertaining enough to sell popcorn, marketable to the masses, and destined to be forgotten by the time the credits rolled. You had two reporters, some snappy banter like danger, and enough star power to distract the audience from the plot holes. Without anyone asking difficult questions, the studio thought they had a foolproof package. You have to remember Juliaroberts wasn't just successful back then, she was a phenomenon. She was completely untouchable, the rare breed of star who could guarantee a #1 opening weekend while still feeling like your best friend. Audiences trusted her implicitly. Nick Nolte, however, brought a completely different energy to the table. He was the gritty, respected, but volatile method guy known for intensity and unpredictability, a reputation for chaos that the marketing team tried to spin as a sexy opposites attract dynamic. But instead of sparks flying, we witnessed a catastrophic collision that started practically the moment they signed their contracts. From the very first days of shooting, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. It wasn't fleeting. And it wasn't the kind of harmless on-set drama people whisper about at craft services. This hatred was structural. The crew wasn't gossiping about a lack of chemistry. They were discussing damage containment and logistical workarounds to keep the peace. Suddenly, the shooting schedule was being quietly rewritten, and rehearsals were segregated so the leads didn't have to breathe the same air. Entire scenes were reworked not to make the movie better, but simply to survive the day. These are absolutely not the signs of a standard creative disagreement. Look, actors don't need to be best friends to do their jobs. They just need to be professional enough to function when the director yells, "Action!" On this set, even basic functioning became a Herculean task, and the simple narrative that they just didn't get along doesn't even begin to cover the scale of the warfare. So how did a safe, mid-budget romantic thriller designed to print money turn into such a disaster? How did it become one of Hollywood's most whispered-about cautionary tales regarding production nightmares? What exactly went down when the cameras weren't focused on them that forced the studio to switch from promotion mode to survival mode? Here is the ugly truth. Hollywood rarely admits when a set turns toxic. It's almost never an explosion that happens all at once. It happens incrementally, a snide comment that hangs in the air, a tone that gets too sharp, boundaries that are crossed and then trampled on repeatedly. It continues until nobody on the crew is quite sure where the line of acceptable behaviour was supposed to be in the first place. Years later, as the real accounts started to leak out, it became painfully clear that this wasn't mutual hostility or a battle of equals. It was something far darker. Let's be real about the dynamic on set. It was completely lopsided. Julia Roberts wasn't engaging in some petty catfight or diva off. She was surviving a toxic war zone that slowly chipped away at her peace of mind. Insiders and crew members would later spill the tea, describing days where production ground to a screeching halt, leaving everyone looking around in awkward silence. And this wasn't because a bulb blew out or a camera jammed. It was the suffocating atmosphere, a dark cloud so heavy that people literally started whispering and tiptoeing just to avoid setting off a landmine. Entire scenes were being reblocked at the 11th hour, throwing the schedule into total chaos. Scripts were being rewritten without a single meeting, and directors were changing gears in the middle of a take, not for some stroke of artistic genius, but as a desperate defensive strategy to keep the peace. Let's be clear, these constant shuffles weren't about making a masterpiece. They were frantic attempts to stop a full-blown meltdown from happening on the lot. It got so bad that production schedules were quietly manipulated behind the scenes, specifically designed so the two leads spent significantly less time in the same room than the screenplay actually demanded. From an artistic standpoint, that is a disaster, but from a psychological perspective, it makes total sense. That isn't just a feud, folks. That is containment protocol. And let's be honest, containment measures only get rolled out when the suits upstairs realise the situation has gone completely off the rails and there is no turning back. If the chemistry on screen looked passable or even polished to the casual viewer, you have to ask, why was the entire production restructured in the shadows just to keep its two biggest stars in separate corners? What kind of backstage nightmare forces a major studio to segregate rehearsals and butcher scenes for reasons that have absolutely zero to do with creative vision? The burning question on everyone's mind has always been, why didn't Julia blow the whistle right then and there? What the tabloids and surface-level coverage missed completely is that Julia Roberts had the power to burn it all down immediately if she wanted to, but she chose silence. It wasn't because she was shaking in her boots. It was because she knew that in Hollywood, timing is a much more valuable currency than the truth. You have to remember the context of the 1990s. Women who voiced complaints, especially the ones who were winning at the box office, were instantly branded as the problem. The media narrative would have flipped on a dime, painting her as an ungrateful brat, notoriously difficult or just too fragile to handle a strong male personality. Julia was savvy enough to know that screaming about the injustice too early would only destroy her own credibility before the actual facts ever hit the newsstands. So she did exactly what smart, powerful women trapped in broken systems have learned to do. She kept the receipts. She waited it out. She allowed the toxic patterns to expose themselves over time. When she finally decided to address the elephant in the room years later, she didn't get emotional or messy. Her comments were surgical, precise, and devastatingly calm. She didn't throw around wild accusations. She simply defined the reality of what happened. And trust me, definition is way more dangerous than an accusation, because once you label bad behaviour clearly, it can't hide behind the excuses of method acting or eccentric charm anymore. In that split second, the old Hollywood spin machine stopped working. But the drama didn't end when the director yelled cut for the final time. That was just the beginning of the Cold War. Coming up, we are going to dissect the specific moment Julia dropped a bomb that quietly obliterated the industry-approved version of events. We'll look at why casting directors suddenly stopped putting certain names on the same call sheet. We will reveal how both leads walked away with very different battle scars and what this legendary feud exposed about a secret Hollywood rule that is still very much in play today. Make no mistake, Hollywood eventually picked a winner. The moment that shifted the entire landscape didn't happen with a screaming headline or a leaked memo from a producer's desk. It wasn't a tearful tell-all or a public showdown. It happened with a level of subtlety that is almost terrifying, the way the biggest power shifts in Tinseltown usually do quietly and right under our noses. Long after I Love Trouble had wrapped and the press junket circus had moved on to the next big thing, Julia Roberts faced a generic question during a standard interview about on-screen chemistry. It was the kind of fluff question actors get asked 1,000 times and usually answer on autopilot with a fake smile. Instead, she paused, offered a polite, icy smile, and simply stated that working with Nick Nolte had been not pleasant. The words themselves were polite, almost diplomatic, but that pause was heavy enough to sink a ship, and everyone in the room felt the temperature drop. In an industry built on fake praise and euphemisms, that kind of understatement is absolutely lethal. Julia didn't need to go on a rant. She didn't need to spill the gritty details or scream. She simply refused to sugarcoat a miserable experience. And that refusal shattered the carefully curated illusion that this was just a mutual clash of titans. The industry insiders understood exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just reopening an old wound. She was slamming the door on the lie that had been protecting the toxicity for years. For ages, the studios had tried to spin this conflict as a battle of equals. Just two strong-willed artists who couldn't find their rhythm. Julia's statement made that spin impossible to sell because she wasn't describing a conflict she participated in. She was describing an ordeal she survived, and you can't debate someone's lived experience. What followed wasn't a public outcry, but a silent shifting of gears. The casting patterns in town started to change visibly. Specific pairings just vanished from the realm of possibility. Certain names stopped appearing on the same shortlist for major projects. Hollywood never issued a formal verdict, but the judgment was clear. What people rarely talk about is that while both actors paid a price, the bill was not split evenly. Julia Roberts continued to reign supreme, raking in hits, but something in her demeanour subtly shifted. She became significantly more guarded, extremely selective, and refused to walk into any project where the power dynamics weren't laid out in black and white. The breezy open book persona that made the world fall in love with her tightened up, replaced by steel boundaries that she never needed before this disaster. Nick Nolte, on the other hand, found that the golden gates of Hollywood didn't exactly slam shut in his face, but they certainly stopped swinging open with the same welcoming ease. His projects began to stall out in development hell. The once hot opportunities started to soften and fade away. The industry, in its infinite cruelty, didn't explicitly exile him to the wilderness. Instead, it quietly contained him, putting a ceiling on his career that hadn't been there before. And that strategy of containment tells you everything you need to know about how the sausage is made. Behind the velvet rope, studio executives and power players began handling similar volatile situations with a completely different playbook. This shift wasn't born out of some sudden moral awakening or ethical epiphany, but out of pure, unadulterated fear. The disastrous I Love Trouble set had mutated into a legendary cautionary tale, the kind whispered about in hushed tones during high-stakes production meetings whenever the terrifying topics of risk assessment, star temperament and insurance liability came up. Julia Roberts' masterful restraint during the whole ordeal had given her an undeniable credibility that no amount of PR spin could buy. And let's be honest, credibility is absolutely lethal to bad behaviour because the truth doesn't need any embellishment or theatrical performance to sting. The industry power brokers realised a terrifying truth. If someone like America's sweetheart, a woman with absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose, was willing to let even a tiny sliver of the ugly truth escape into the press, then the old boys club rules weren't as bulletproof as they once thought. But there is a much deeper, darker layer to this scandal that often gets glossed over in the retelling. And honestly, it is the most uncomfortable part of the saga. The Hollywood machine didn't just fail Julia Roberts in that specific moment of crisis. It coldly studied the situation like a military operation and adjusted its defences to ensure the fortress remained impenetrable next time. Rather than dismantling the toxic structures that allowed such hostile environments to flourish in the first place, the studios refined the mechanisms that kept those environments quiet. The non-disclosure agreements became tighter, stricter, and more terrifying. Mediation tactics became more strategic and ruthless. Publicists became significantly more proactive in killing stories before they breathed. The lesson wasn't, let's prevent this trauma from happening again. The lesson was simply, make sure the story never escapes the lot. And yet, despite the cover-up, something in the air had undeniably shifted. Julia had demonstrated to the world that silence was an active choice, not a contractual obligation, and that the truth didn't need to arrive with a megaphone to be effective. A whisper could destroy just as well. Her carefully chosen words lingered like a ghost, resurfacing every single time discussions about difficult sets, massive power imbalances, or unchecked ego-driven behaviour emerged in the trades. When younger actors later built up the courage to speak about feeling unsafe or undermined on set, the industry could no longer pretend these were just isolated incidents of drama. There was a major precedent now, and established precedents make the game of denial infinitely harder to play. What makes this specific feud so incredibly revealing isn't just that it was ugly. Hollywood has always tolerated and even celebrated ugliness if it sells tickets. It is that it exposes how easily the entire system defaults to protecting volatility and abuse when it comes wrapped in a prestigious reputation. Julia Roberts didn't dismantle that corrupt system overnight, obviously, but she cracked the facade just enough to let a little bit of blinding light shine through the cracks. She proved that you don't have to scream and shout to be heard, and that sometimes the most disruptive punk rock act you can commit is simply refusing to lie to cover someone else's tracks. By the time this story fully settled into the canon of Hollywood lore, the narrative had shifted not officially in the press releases and not publicly on the red carpet, but internally where it matters. People stopped asking the gossip column question of what went wrong between those two actors and started asking the real question, why did no one with power intervene sooner? That is a question that still doesn't have a comfortable answer, because answering it requires acknowledging a hard truth that the industry knew exactly how to step in and fix it, but actively chose not to for the sake of the bottom line. That discomfort was tolerated right up until it became unmanageable, and the emotional cost was paid quietly by the person who refused to escalate the drama until escalation was the only honest option left on the table. And this is exactly where the story stops being about one mediocre movie or one celebrity feud and starts becoming a commentary about the toxic culture that produced it. I Love Trouble wasn't just a box office anomaly. It was a warning shot fired across the bow of the industry. It was a signal that Hollywood ignored until years later, when it finally became impossible to keep pretending that silence was a neutral stance. How did a single carefully phrased comment from Julia Roberts years later manage to completely undo an industry-approved narrative that had been protected by publicists for so long? Why did the Hollywood establishment react not with outrage or loud denial, but with a quiet, terrified recalibration of their tactics? The real aftermath is the part no one talked about. What happened after I Love Trouble didn't unfold in screaming tabloid headlines or messy courtroom documents. It unfolded quietly in the strategic choices Julia Roberts began to make and the decisions she refused to explain to the press. To the general public, her career looked completely uninterrupted, even enviable, as she continued her reign as queen of the screen. The massive hits kept coming, the prestigious awards followed, and her star power remained perfectly intact. But beneath that glossy surface success, something fundamental had shifted in her approach. Julia didn't just move on from a bad experience like nothing happened. She completely recalibrated how she moved through the shark-infested waters of Hollywood altogether. If you look closely at her filmography after that dark period, a distinct pattern emerges that most casual viewers never even noticed. She consciously gravitated toward projects where power dynamics were clearer, where directors were known collaborators rather than authoritarian tyrants, and where the on-set environment mattered just as much as the script itself. She worked repeatedly with people she already trusted and knew, creating a safety net around her performances. She didn't do this because she lacked offers from others, but because trust had become a non-negotiable line item in her contracts. This wasn't just some artistic coincidence or preference. It was a calculated act of self-preservation. The woman who once seemed effortlessly open and accessible began building invisible walls not to shut people out of her life, but to keep herself safe from the industry's darker nature. And Hollywood absolutely noticed, even if the executives never said so out loud. Julia became known as professional, hyper-prepared, and incredibly firm about her boundaries. And not difficult, not demanding, but firm. That distinction matters immensely because in the coded language of Hollywood, firmness from a woman is often treated as defiance or diva behaviour. Yet Julia's massive star power insulated her from that backlash. She had leverage and she used it quietly, insisting on respect without ever framing it as a public crusade. She wasn't throwing fits, she was throwing shade with surgical precision. Julia didn't just push back, she rewrote the playbook on resistance, proving that in a town built on loud egos, true power is all about maintaining icy, impenetrable control. On the flip side, Tinseltown's love affair with Nick Nolte was heading straight for a messy divorce. The industry was starting to look at him differently, and let's just say the rose-coloured glasses were coming off. That tortured genius shtick. It was getting old fast. What used to be seen as ruggedly difficult but brilliant was starting to smell like a liability in an era where studios were becoming obsessed with minimising risk and maximising the bottom line. Execs didn't care about the morality of his antics, they cared about the math. It wasn't about whether he was a bad boy, it was about whether he was a bad investment. They didn't preach, they just crunched the numbers. When insurance premiums start skyrocketing and production schedules get tighter than a facelift patient's wears thin, suddenly very few power players were willing to bet their multi-million-dollar projects on a wild card who might implode before lunch. Make no mistake, Hollywood didn't spank him for bad behaviour. This town doesn't have a conscience. They simply looked at the ledger and decided the headache just wasn't worth the hassle anymore. He was cancelled by the calculator, not the culture. And here is the dirty little secret that outsiders always miss. The Dream Factory doesn't run on justice, fairness, or karma. It runs on pure, unadulterated convenience. Julia didn't come out on top because she held the moral high ground. She survived the Shark Tank because she was a shapeshifter, adaptable enough to outswim the predators. She mastered the dark art of surviving a machine that only hits the brakes when it hits a wall. And the kicker. She did it all without begging for a pity party or a round of applause. But don't think for a second that kind of resilience comes free. There was a steep price tag attached, one that you won't find listed on any box office receipt or end-of-year fiscal report. She paid with her innocence, trading in her naivety for a cold, hard look at how power truly operates once the director yells cut and the real games begin. The sheer toxicity of the I Love Trouble disaster planted a seed deep in the Hollywood soil. It was festering there long before the industry was forced to face its own demons in the public square. Years later, when fresh-faced starlets started whispering in dressing rooms about nightmare sets, wandering hands and egos the size of Texas, the conversation shifted. Julia's name wasn't whispered as a warning of what not to do. No, she was cited as living proof that you could walk through the fire, endure the burns, and still remember exactly who held the matches. Her ordeal became the ultimate reference point, a silent, grim reminder that the studio system has a PhD in self-preservation, even if it fails miserably at protecting the actual human beings keeping the lights on. What really sends a shiver down the spine is just how eerily familiar this whole saga feels in the cold light of today. It is the classic script: a heavy hitter acts like a monster, and instead of stopping him, the whole ecosystem morphs to accommodate the madness. The victim eats the trauma, and the industry keeps its hands clean with plausible deniability. For decades, this toxic cycle was on repeat, slicked back by high-priced publicists and justified by the almighty dollar. Rinse, repeat, cash the check. The only variable that ever shifted was who finally got permission to grab the mic, and usually that only happened when the silence stopped making sense, literally. Note that America's sweetheart never painted herself as the damsel in distress or the victim. And frankly, that specific choice is exactly why her narrative still hits like a freight train. Playing the victim gets you dismissed in this town. Asserting agency gets you a seat at the table. She didn't waste breath asking Hollywood to grow a conscience. Instead, she tweaked her own operating system to hack the mainframe, and in the process, she laid bare just how broken the whole machine really was. Suits could ignore screaming accusations all day long, but they couldn't ignore the tectonic shift in power that happened when their golden goose quietly decided she was done playing their game. By the time the dam finally broke and the trades were flooded with stories about toxic sets and abusive behaviour, years down the line, the context had changed. That I Love Trouble mess didn't look like some dusty old tabloid scandal anymore. It looked like a flashing red warning light that everyone had conveniently ignored because they were too busy counting cash. The system hadn't learned a damn thing about preventing damage. It had just perfected the art of surviving the fallout and burying the bodies. And Julia, whether she signed up for it or not, she became the living, breathing evidence of the wreckage left behind and the brutal adaptation required to stay standing. So why didn't the I Love Trouble catastrophe explode into a frenzy of lawsuits and front-page headlines? Instead, it bubbled up through subtle, calculated career pivots that only the sharpest insiders picked up on. You have to wonder what ruthless decisions were made in smoke-filled rooms that permanently altered the trajectory of two massive stars. How did the industry quietly shift its approach to handling the Roberts and Nolte brands? The silence wasn't a bug, it was the feature. The silence was the system working exactly as designed. When Tinseltown finally started airing its dirty laundry about abusive power dynamics and soul-crushing work environments, the saga of I Love Trouble felt hauntingly familiar, like a dark prophecy fulfilled. What everyone dismissed as a singular catfight back in the day now reads like the opening chapter of a much larger, darker tell-all book about industry abuse. It is a book the industry spent decades trying to burn before anyone could read the first page. Here is the uncomfortable truth that keeps execs up at night. Hollywood didn't fail because they were clueless. They failed because keeping their mouths shut was working perfectly for the bottom line. Silence kept the production schedules on track, protected the multi-million-dollar investments, and let everyone cash out without ever facing a shred of accountability. And as long as looking the other way turned a profit, nobody called it complicity. They called it professionalism and gave themselves awards for it. That is exactly what makes Julia's restraint so deeply unsettling when you look back. She didn't expose the rot by taking a sledgehammer to the system directly. She exposed it by simply surviving it without signing off on the lies. See, Hollywood expects a tantrum or a noisy meltdown when things go south. Noise, They can handle noise. Noise can be spun, minimised and reframed by a good PR team. But what terrifies them is quiet, unshakable credibility. Julia never gave the machine a messy scandal to smother with a pillow. She didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she held up a mirror, forced them to look at their own ugly reflection, and walked away in heels. The I Love Trouble set wasn't a disaster because of a lack of leadership. It was a chaotic hellscape because way too many people had a vested financial interest in doing absolutely nothing about it. Every director, producer, suit and agent knew the score. Escalating the issue wasn't just a creative risk, it was financial suicide. Stepping in meant admitting the house was on fire. And admitting there was a problem that spells liability. And liability is just a fancy word for delays. Costly reshoots, messy contract renegotiations, and the kind of headlines that ruin careers. So the system did what it does best. It morphed around the dysfunction, absorbed the blow, and pretended that working in a war zone was just business as usual. Julia Roberts turned out to be the silent variable that the Hollywood machine totally failed to calculate. She didn't just explode in a fit of rage. She didn't go on a vengeful rampage, and she certainly didn't have a public meltdown for the tabloids to feast on. Instead, she soaked up the toxicity, completely redrew her personal boundaries, and kept grinding in a way that quietly but firmly gave the middle finger to the conditions that tried to break her. And by doing that, she proved something absolutely terrifying to the establishment. She proved that reaching the A-list pinnacle didn't require bowing down to toxic behaviour. That revelation was a direct threat to the oldest excuse in the book, one the industry desperately clung to. The twisted idea that enduring abuse and bad behaviour was just the price of admission for a ticket to stardom. Now, the Nick Nolte side of this saga exposes the ugly underbelly of that system. For decades, being a volatile nightmare on set had been rebranded as authenticity. Emotional instability was marketed to us as artistic depth. Let's be real, the industry didn't reward stability. It practically fetishized chaos, romanticizing the mess as long as it translated to Oscar-worthy moments. But that tolerance had an expiration date. It all hinged on a fragile equation balancing the headache of the star against their box office value. The moment that scale tipped, when the unpredictability became more expensive than the star was worth, the industry didn't suddenly grow a conscience. They just quietly ghosted him, not because Hollywood suddenly found ethics, but because they were simply exhausted by the drama. This is exactly why this feud is still piping hot tea today. It's not about the petty insults, it's the perfect case study of how Tinseltown calculates the cost of human collateral. The suits don't ask who got hurt. They ask how much money will the truth cost us more, and how much of a PR nightmare will this cause? Julia Roberts' ordeal sits right at the centre of that ruthless calculation, a stark reminder that in this town, silence is rarely neutral and almost never an accident. It is a calculated move, carefully curated and enforced by publicists until it stops protecting the bottom line. What makes this story stick in our minds is the creepy fact that nothing actually changed about the system that allowed it to happen. So what was really left in the rubble of I Love Trouble? By the time the movie limped out of theatres, the box office numbers had already screamed the verdict loud and clear. No matter how much the studio prayed for a rom-com blockbuster, it became painfully obvious this flick wasn't going to redefine anyone's career. But the real wreckage didn't show up in the Rotten Tomatoes score or ticket sales. That was just surface damage. The true fallout bled into on-set behaviour casting decisions and the hushed conversations held behind closed doors in executive suites for years to come. For Julia Roberts, the experience triggered a major vibe shift. Before I Love Trouble, she had a reputation as America's sweetheart, easygoing, adaptable and totally accommodating on set. After the dust settled, that reputation didn't vanish, but it got a lot more specific and a lot sharper around the edges. She became incredibly surgical about her projects, vetting her co-stars like a detective and avoiding any production where the power dynamics felt even slightly off-kilter. This wasn't some loud public campaign or a hashtag movement. It was a subtle pattern that the real industry insiders picked up on immediately. Roberts continued to book massive gigs, obviously, but you rarely saw her stepping into a chaotic circus like that ever again. Nick Nolte, on the other hand, was on a totally different downward sloping trajectory. To be fair, his reputation for being a loose cannon didn't start with I Love Trouble, but this production basically poured concrete over it. Inside the studio lots and insurance offices, the film became the ultimate cautionary tale, not because of one specific fight, but because the constant disruption was a financial liability. Production started doing the math on his temperament versus his talent, and let's just say the numbers weren't looking good for Nolte. He increasingly found himself pushed into roles that either leaned into his jagged edges or kept him safely away from the main cast to minimise the blast radius. Here is the kicker: there was never a moment of truth. No official reckoning ever went down. There were no formal complaints leaked to the press, no arbitration records opened, and certainly no studio statements admitting they let things get out of hand. The consequences were dished out in the shadows through quiet decisions and casting passes that were never explained to the public. That is the classic Hollywood playbook for dealing with dirty laundry. Sweep it under the red carpet and pretend it never happened. When the film finally faded from memory, what consequences actually stuck to Julia and Nick long after the bad reviews stopped stinging? How did one disastrous shoot quietly rewrite their futures? This is how the narrative hardened into stone. As the decades rolled on, the complex reality of the Roberts-Nolte feud got flattened into a simple tabloid-friendly version that hid the ugly truth. Interviews boiled the whole thing down to mutual dislike. The headline screamed personality clash instead of looking at the toxic dynamics at play. The phrase "they hated each other" became the lazy shorthand, completely glossing over why the set was so dysfunctional it basically needed a referee. Roberts eventually addressed the drama in rare clipped comments, famously describing Nolte as not pleasant, which is putting it mildly. The restraint in that wording is actually wild, especially considering the mountain of rumours swirling around the feud. She didn't drop a tell-all book, she didn't name names, and she didn't give us the juicy context we all wanted. Nolte, by contrast, didn't have the same filter. He hit back with sharper tongue in interviews, calling Roberts not nice and escalating the feud before awkwardly walking it back later. These snappy public jabs just fed the beast, convincing the world it was a mutual war rather than a situation of cause and effect. But if you talk to the people inside the industry, the narrative isn't nearly that symmetrical. The crew members and production staff who survived that shoot whisper a different tune, cautious and vague, sure, but they all acknowledge that the tension wasn't exactly a 50-50 split. Behind the velvet ropes, those frantic on-set adjustments weren't just remembered as petty creative disagreements or artistic clashes between stars. No insiders saw them as desperate do-or-die triage measures absolutely essential to keep that sinking ship of a production from capping completely. Of course, that specific distinction never fully made it into the glossy public discourse, but trust me, it heavily influenced exactly how both actors were judged by the power players behind the scenes. Post I Love Trouble. America's sweetheart Julia Roberts didn't just survive, she continued to dominate at an elite level, but her professional world became significantly more guarded and controlled. You started seeing her stick like glue to directors and co-stars she had already vetted and trusted, effectively slashing the odds of ever dealing with unpredictable, toxic dynamics again. Now, her team didn't spin this calculation as fear or avoidance. Oh no, they marketed it as pure, unadulterated professional efficiency. Suddenly, a Roberts production became the industry gold standard for stability, not drama. Nick Nolte kept booking gigs too, but notice how his roles started morphing to uncomfortably mirror that abrasive, troubled and volatile public persona. To the casual moviegoer munching on popcorn, this blurred line between man and character might have seemed totally natural, maybe even expected. But make no mistake, it severely shrank the sandbox he was allowed to play in. The industry didn't officially blacklist him, but they definitely slapped a label on his forehead and categorised him. And we all know in this town, once you are categorised, breaking out is nearly impossible. The real tea is that neither career crashed and burned solely because of this box office mess. Instead, their trajectories were quietly nudged in different directions. Roberts' empire didn't shrink, it just got laser-focused and incredibly strategic to protect the asset. On the flip side, Nolte's reputation contracted into a narrow lane. These shifts weren't announced in a press release, but believe me, everyone in the casting offices felt the temperature change. So you have to ask yourself who really cashed in by reducing this complex mess into a simple narrative of they just hated each other, instead of examining the real cause and power imbalance. And why on earth did that sanitized version become the legendary lore repeated publicly, even while crew members who were actually in the trenches whispered a much darker reality over drinks? Why do we keep dragging this decades-old feud out of the grave every time we talk about on-set chemistry disasters? The reason the Julia Roberts and Nick Nolte saga is still hot gossip isn't just because it gave us juicy sound bites or iconic tabloid moments. It is because it stands as the ultimate masterclass in how the Hollywood machine manages high-stakes conflict without ever actually bothering to resolve a single thing. The situation never blew up with lawyers in public, never resulted in formal action, and certainly never required the studio to take institutional accountability. Instead, the dysfunction was just quietly absorbed by the system and regurgitated back out as personal reputational baggage for the stars to carry. Years later, when other sets turned toxic insiders would hush their voices and cite I Love Trouble as the cautionary tale of exactly what happens when issues are merely managed rather than addressed. It etched itself into the industry's dark memory bank, remembered less as a scandalous event and more as a brutal textbook lesson in corporate containment strategies. It goes without saying Roberts and Nolte never shared a frame again. There was no heartwarming reconciliation project or bury the hatchet photo op. We never got that public resolution we crave. The story just fizzled out the way so many Tinseltown tragedies do, zero closure but a whole lot of lingering, invisible scar tissue. When the dust settled, I Love Trouble didn't define who Julia or Nick were as icons, but it absolutely permanently rewrote the rulebook on how the industry approached them professionally. Roberts emerged from the wreckage with an iron grip on her contracts and working conditions, ensuring she was never vulnerable again. Nolte, on the other hand, walked away with a reinforced reputation for being difficult that shadowed him like a dark cloud into the subsequent decades of his work. This feud stays relevant in the gossip history books, not because it was a screaming match, but because the consequences were so quiet, deep, and incredibly lasting. It perfectly illustrates how an entire career landscape can shift without a single official statement ever being made, proving that reputations here are shaped just as much by the silence as by the headlines. That is the real legacy of I Love Trouble. Not a massive public scandal, but a subtle recalibration that both actors had to carry on their backs long after the film itself ended up in the bargain bin. If this deep dive totally flipped your perspective on this vintage drama, you need to smash that subscribe button right now to stay in the loop. We have got a vault full of buried Hollywood secrets where the real messy fallout was carefully kept off the front page of the trades. Drop a comment below on which legendary feud or disaster film you want us to expose next. And remember, darling, silence protects the narrative, but our attention exposes the truth.